Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Saturday, February 17th slate of college basketball DFS. We are switching the format back to the old way. We're going to be breaking down the main slate for Saturday, February 17th. That is the slate that starts at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, aka noon Eastern Time. And we're going to go through all 12 games, and we're going to break down each game and, what you can expect from each game, as well as who you need to be targeting for your lineups and kind of what you need to be aware of from each game before you sit down and make your DraftKings and your FanDuel lineups. I'm recording this now pretty late at night. I'm hoping to get this out before 11 p.m. Eastern time. I've kind of mentioned on the podcast here before, but that I do have a 5-month-old daughter, and right now she's kind of sick. So, I don't know how quickly I'm going to be able to get this recorded. If I need to go take care of her. But depending on how the night goes, I could end up having some additional content for the afternoon and the night slates. So make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel on YouTube. Subscribe to the audio feed if you're listening on audio. That way you can get notified if and when that afternoon and night slate episode does in fact drop. I'm not going to make any promises, but if I'm going to be awake, I might as well try to go ahead and get some content out there for the later two slates. Makes sense, right? So anyway, that's the situation that we're looking at right now. If you have been to the channel for a while, please hit the like button for this video and please rate and review the audio. It really does help me out a ton, and I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. But anyway, that kind of does it for the introduction. We've got a 12-game slate here on Saturday, and this is one of those slates where there's 12 games, but really only like 8 of them are actually like targetable for DFS. And so we're going to break down, why and how you need to be targeting those games. And we're going to go ahead and tip things off here with game number 1 on the slate. Now, ironically enough, game number 1 on the slate has the slate's highest total. It is a matchup between Texas A&M and Alabama. It is projected to be 85 to 75 in favor of Alabama. That line is according to KenPom. So we've got a nice little 160-point total. Generally speaking, Alabama plays in a lot of games that feature a lot of scoring. And so even if you're not targeting guys on Alabama, I do think you can target against Alabama and have a little bit of success. They just play at such a fast tempo that, it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? The team that plays against them usually ends up getting a pretty big boost in terms of fantasy production. And for Texas A&M, they're a really interesting team to target. They're kind of a weird team statistically. They are an elite level rebounding team. They actually lead the nation in offensive rebounding rate, but they don't have a dominant big. In fact, one of their best rebounders is one of their guards, Tyrese Radford. And to me, he is probably the player that I want to target the most from this game. He has shown legitimate 45 fantasy point upside, which he had against Kentucky. He also had 40 against Tennessee. He is a guard that has a super high usage rate and will get you rebounds and assists. And in a game like this, that's going to feature a ton of possessions, it's going to have a ton of opportunities for rebounds. Now, their overall best player for the Aggies is Wade Taylor IV. He will usually be their shot leader. He leads them in shot rate on the season, and he leads them in fantasy scoring on the season. Now, what's interesting with Taylor, though, is he'll also get a decent amount of peripheral stats, and it's not uncommon to see both Tyrese, a.k.a. Boots Radford, and Wade Taylor IV hit value together. They both had over 40 fantasy points 2 games ago against Tennessee, and that was a game in which A&M scored 85 points. So I actually think playing both of them together is, in fact, a viable strategy, and I don't think you have to choose one or the other. Now, after that, the only other guard that really plays now is Jace Carter. He's kind of taken over Hayden Hefner's minutes. His fantasy production has been not terrible. He's had over 20 fantasy points in 4 of the last 5. We would like a little bit more than that from a guy that's 5,600, but in a game that's going to be played at a breakneck pace and a guy that's going to play 30-plus minutes, you got to like him as a value play. Now, the 3 bigs that play for Texas A&M are Anderson Garcia, Solomon Washington, and Henry Coleman. Levesque also starts, but he really just kind of plays the first 8 minutes and then says, see ya, and then he's on the bench for the rest of the game. So really I want to focus on Garcia, Washington, and Carter. Oddly enough, Washington has been starting, but I think he's the worst of the 3, just being honest. And his minute totals have been very varied in recent weeks. He played only 18 minutes against Missouri, but other than that, he's played 30 minutes or more in 3 of the last 4. He has shown 30 fantasy point upside. He has 28 fantasy points in 2 of the last 4. I don't mind it, but I think that Garcia and Coleman are better players. Coleman has only been limited by his own minutes total. He has a really solid usage rate when he does, in fact, enter the game, but recently he has not played over 22 minutes or more in the last 5 games, and it's because of Solomon Washington playing a lot of minutes. points. So I just don't really know what to make of that situation. I think Coleman's the better player, but Washington's been playing more and been putting up more fantasy points. And then you have Anderson Garcia, who's kind of like a small ball pit bull of a power forward. He does not take a whole lot of shots, but he doesn't need to. In 2 of the last 3 games, he's put up 16 and 17 rebounds. He is pretty much rebound dependent for fantasy scoring, but like in a game that's going to feature a ton of possession, there's going to be a ton of opportunities for rebounds. So I don't mind playing any of the 3 bigs. I certainly wouldn't play any of them together though. And I think ideally, if you're going to stack up this Texas A&M side, I think you can play at least one of the 2 guards, Taylor and Radford, and then one additional piece between Carter and the 3 bigs. Now, on the Alabama side, we know who they are. We've seen them a ton. They have 2 lead guards, Mark Sears and Aaron Estrada. Sears is generally the better fantasy performer. He generally takes slightly more shots, but overall, their usage rates are about the same. The only thing that really separates them is Estrada tends to get in foul trouble. But in games where Estrada doesn't get in foul trouble, he has equal ceiling as Mark Sears. He's put up over 35 fantasy points, which will be 5x value for his $7,000 salary in 2 of the last 5 games. I think that if you're a usage rate truther, their usage rates are super similar. Like there's not that much that separates them. If you're a usage rate truther, play Estrada over Sears and save the $1,800. I will be playing a little bit of both tomorrow, and I do think you can play both of them together, but I think ideally you would want to play one or the other, especially if you want to try to fit in Radford or Taylor on the other side. Now, Wrightsell and Griffin are the 2 wings for this team that, I mean, when you look back at Alabama recently over the last few weeks, like one of them tends to have a big night, right? Like Wrightsell had 46 fantasy points against LSU. And then you've got Rylan Griffin, who where was his ceiling game was 31 also against LSU, and then 30 against Auburn earlier in the month. So really, one of those 2 guys is very likely to hit value. I don't know which one it's going to be. It's whichever one is going to show up and shoot the ball better, and I don't really have any leans as to which of the 2 it's going to be. Now, for their bigs, Grant Nelson is their starting center, and I like him a lot. He blocks a lot of shots, and this is a Texas A&M team that gets a lot of shots blocked. I would kind of hypothesize that they get a lot of shots blocked because they get a lot of offensive rebounds. And if you're going right back up with it, it's kind of easy to block. So that might make things a little bit easy for Nelson to accumulate fantasy points if he's getting blocked. But a guy that I like for a lot of upside at cost is Nick Pringle. So he was suspended for a violation of team rules. He returned against Auburn, played 14 minutes, was 1 for 7 from the field, put up 10 fantasy points. But the next game against LSU, he was 8 for 9 from the field, put up 25 fantasy points. So there's a legitimate ceiling there. You really don't know what you're going to get. I don't think there's any safety or security in playing Nick Pringle, but I definitely like his upside at only $4,500. And then Diabate, Stevenson, and Walters and Waggy, they're all 4 going to play minutes. Like they're all 4 going to be out there. The question is if they'll be out there enough to actually score fantasy points. I think if you're playing enough GPP lineups, you can sprinkle in all 4 of them, Diabate, Stevenson, Walters, and Waggy, but I also think you can just avoid it and be all the same. I don't think it's very likely that one of them has a ceiling performance. All right, now heading on to the next game, we've got Texas Tech taking on Iowa State. This is a pretty big showdown in the Big 12. These are 2 teams who are vastly outperforming their preseason expectations. KenPom has this game projected to be 74-67 in favor of Iowa State. And look, this is not a great game environment. Neither of these 2 teams play very fast. Both of them are elite defensively. I think you can just avoid it. Darion Williams is all the way up to 7,400, which is the highest I have ever seen him, coming off of that ceiling game against Kansas where he put up 57 fantasy points, where he was 12 for 12 from the field. Look, that's not happening again. He's not going 12 for 12 from the field again, and I don't like the price increase. So hard pass on Darion Williams for me tomorrow until that price comes back down. I do like Pop Isaacs, though. He is still their usage leader on the season, and he still gets a ton of usage. He's just been kind of bad in the last 2 games. He's 3 for 22 from the field combined in their last 2 games. You got to think he's due for some positive regression, though, and he's at the lowest salary he's been at since the start of conference play. So I definitely, if I'm going to play anybody on this Texas Tech side, it's going to be Pop Isaacs, put it that way. Now, on the Iowa State side, they have 2 very much lead guards, Gilbert and Lipsey. Gilbert has slightly overtaken Lipsey on the season lead in terms of usage rate, but like if you look at the game logs, both of them have the ability to hit value. Like they're both at very reasonable price tags for what they've been doing. They're going to be the 2 guys who lead this offense, and both of them have shown the ability to hit value. I kind of really like the savings that we're getting on Lipsey. This is a guy who was in the upper 8K range about a month ago. So Tamin Lipsey is probably going to be the guy that I get to the most on this Iowa State side. But again, I think you can avoid this game altogether and just be totally fine. Next up is TCU taking on Kansas State. This is another game that honestly you can cross off, but I do think there's a few situations to note in here, especially moving forward to the end of the season. KenPom has this one projected to finish as 71-70 in favor of the Horned Frogs. Now for TCU, they made an adjustment to their starting lineup in the last game. They moved Jameer Nelson in and Avery Anderson out. So now they play with 2 point guards, Travion Tennyson and then Jameer Nelson Jr., Micah Peavy playing the 3, Emmanuel Miller at the 4, and Ernest Uday at the 5. And Jameer Nelson moving in his starting lineup is pretty relevant, though, y'all. He is their usage leader on the season, and he immediately turned in a 36 fantasy point performance against West Virginia. Granted, West Virginia's backcourt can't guard a chair, but I'd kind of like the upside of knowing that Jameer Nelson's in the starting lineup, knowing that he's going to play additional minutes. I really do like him as a play overall. Now, Jacoby Coles is also starting to kind of overtake his old rollback. Ernest Uday does start at center, but Jacoby Coles is now playing more minutes than him at only $5,300. It doesn't take a whole lot for him to hit value either. Now, on the Kansas State side, we have seen guards with high assist rates go off against TCU, whether it's Pop Isaacs, Max Asmus, this is a team that can be targeted for guards, in my opinion. And if you're going to target one of them, you got 2 options on Kansas State. You got Tyler Perry, who is their leader in assist rate and can be hot or cold from the field, but he does have a very high ceiling. And then you also have Cam Carter, who's a little more dependent on rebounding, would probably prefer a higher paced game if you're playing Cam Carter. But I think that those would be the 2 options I would look at on the Kansas State side. Arthur Kaluma is also a guy that's going to play a ton and have a ton of shots. I don't think he's a terrible option, but I don't like the defensive matchup. Will McNair Jr. is also the bench center in name only. Jarrell Colbert does start at center, but Will McNair is playing more minutes, and he had 26 fantasy points in their last game. I kind of think McNair and Coles are kind of like in a very similar boat, just on opposite sides of the court. Next up, we have Wake Forest taking on Virginia. And you talk about games to cross off. A lot of people are going to cross this one off. Why? Because Virginia's in it. And Virginia is one of the best defensive teams in college basketball. They're one of the slowest tempo teams in college basketball. However, I will mention this game, even though it only has a 131-point total on KenPom. KenPom has it as Virginia 66-65. The reason I'll mention is because both of these teams are very concentrated, especially Wake Forest. Wake Forest only plays 7 players, and their fantasy scoring tends to bunch up among their starting 5. And so even if there's less fantasy points scored over the course of the whole game, if it's divided among less players, then those players are going to score more fantasy points. The math checks out. Trust me, I'm a high school math teacher. So basically, the first meeting between these 2 teams was 66-47 in favor of Wake Forest, and you will see what I mean here in just a second. Wake Forest only scored 66 real points in that game, right? Well, Hunter Salas had 21 and 9 in that game and put up 41 fantasy points. Hunter Salas is my favorite play for Wake Forest. He has taken a combined 37 shots in their last 2 games, put up 48 and 35 fantasy points in those 2 games, by the way. And the way you beat Virginia's pack line defense is isolation jump shooters have been very good at it. And I think Hunter Salas is a guy who can attack off the dribble and pull up, whether it's from 3 or the mid-range. I think he is the right type of player to beat the pack line defense, and that's evidenced by what he did against them earlier in the season, going 8 for 13 from the field, and again, putting up 41 fantasy points. Now, Andrew Carr also had a successful game against Virginia. He had 29.5 fantasy points, a little 12 and 12 double-double action. The thing is with Andrew Carr, we have seen him over the course of the season. He is really good against teams who try to go small. He is a power forward that played a lot of center last year, and he knows how to take advantage of size mismatches. And so Virginia is one of those teams that is going to try to play small, and so that is another situation where I think you can attack with Andrew Carr. Both of these guys were really good against Virginia the first time around, right? Only scored 66 real points. Oh, and by the way, Efton Reed and Boopy Miller, 2 other starters, also had 28 fantasy points in that game against Virginia. So all 4 of Wake Forest's 4 highest usage players scored 28 fantasy points or more in a game where they only scored 66 real points. Don't sleep on the Deeks in this game against Virginia just because it's on paper a terrible matchup. Cam Hildreth, I said this about him on Monday. He's kind of the forgotten guy, but he does have a legitimate ceiling. Monsanto and Fredrickson are going to be the 2 guards who play off the bench. Both of them have the capability of getting hot for 3. And if either of the guards for Wake, Miller, Salas, or Hildreth gets in foul trouble, Monsanto and Fredrickson could see extended run. Now, on the Virginia side, there's not really that much to note. Nobody for Virginia hit 4x value in that first game against Wake, which is to be expected when you only score 47 points. However, that game seemed to ignite Virginia's season. They won 8 straight games after that, and they started playing much better basketball. Reese Beekman is still their usage leader for the season, and if this game does, in fact, end up shooting out and seeing more than 140 points scored, you got to feel like it's going to be because of Rick Beekman scoring a lot of points. He's put up 33 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. One thing that's also interesting is they are now playing Jake Groves a ton of minutes at the 5. The biggest fantasy performance he had was 32 against Notre Dame, followed by a 25 against Clemson. Hasn't really been great in his last 3, but if he's going to play a ton of minutes at the 5, I kind of think there's a chance he could hit value. So those will be the 2 guys I'll be focusing on the Virginia side. Next up, we have Creighton taking on Butler, and this is going to be one where you're going to want to target. Trust me. This one, KenPom has projected to be 76 to 75 in favor of Creighton, but the previous meeting was 99 to 98 in favor of Butler in regulation, no overtime needed. And oh, by the way, Butler didn't have one of their best guards, Posh Alexander, for that game, so there was just a ton of points being scored. And no surprise for Creighton. We've talked about them all season long. They have a clear Big Four who are going to play pretty much the entire game and are going to pretty much feature a 20% usage rate each. All 4 of them, Shireman, Kalkbrenner, Alexander, and Ashworth, all had 20 or more real points in that game, all had 4x value in fantasy or more in that game. And look, just if you're going to get to this game, take your pick between those 4. I don't think there's a need to try to get cute and pick, outside of it with Miller or Farabello, who will play minutes, but those 4 eat up so much of the usage, and I don't really know if you can go wrong between them. Shireman has been the best lately. He's had the highest ceiling lately, but I really don't think you can go wrong if this game ends up shooting out like the last one did. All 4 of them are going to get home. Now for Butler, I already mentioned that Posh Alexander did not play in that game, and what you saw was more usage go towards Jamil Telfort and DJ Davis. Both put up 37 fantasy points. However, one thing I will caution, though, pretty much everybody except for Posh Alexander in their starting 5, Telfort, Davis, and Brooks, all 3 of those guys are very shot dependent. They're going to need to be scoring the basketball if they want to put up a lot of fantasy points. They don't put up a whole lot of peripheral stats, so you're going to be dependent on this game shooting out for Telfort, Davis, or Brooks to get there in terms of value. Posh is the guy that puts up all the peripheral stats. Now, another guy I want to mention for Butler, though, is Finley Bizjack. So he did play 25 minutes in that game against Creighton, put up 16 fantasy points, and you could say it was because Posh missed the game, but he's played double-digit minutes in all of his last 6 actually, and he's been decent. Like, he's kind of a boomer bust, $3,700 guard. Against Marquette, he played really well and put up 22 fantasy points. So if you think that this trend can continue for him, $3,700 is not a whole lot to find out. The last game of this segment is going to be Florida heading to Georgia. KenPom has this one projected to finish 80 to 77 in favor of Florida. The previous meeting was 102-98 in favor of the Gators, and that one was in overtime. But get this, it was still 85 to 85 at the end of regulation. So there is probably going to be a ton of points scored in this one as well. With Florida, in that game against Georgia, you saw a ceiling game from Zion Pullen, Micah Handlockton, and Will Richard. Pretty much, Florida has game in, game out, 2 of their starting 5 really go off. So between Pullen, Clayton, Richard, Samuel, and Handlockton, 2 of those guys are going to go off. If you know which 2 it's going to be, please tell me, because I honestly don't know. To me, the only thing you could bank on is the game against Georgia previously, where, again, we said it was Pullen, Handlockton, and Richard. Handlockton had the highest performance I have ever seen him have. He had 46 fantasy points in that game against Georgia. Pullen's probably the safest play of all of them because he has a super high assist rate. But like I said, just take your pick among those starting 5 and just trust that one of them's going to go off and pray that you get it right. Kugel and Condon are really the only 2 guys that play off the bench. Both of them do have a legitimate ceiling, but there's virtually no safety in playing either of those 2 guys. You never know how many minutes they're going to play or how many shots they're going to take. Now, on the Georgia side, super interesting pricing here. Nobody is above $5,600 on DraftKings. That is crazy to me for a team that scored 98 points in the last time they played this team, and they're projected to score 77 here in this one. Now, Georgia's been slumping lately, and so they have really switched up their starting lineup. The hero of the game against Florida, RJ Melendez, he came off the bench and put up 35 against Florida, good for 53 fantasy points, and he was moved into the starting lineup against Alabama and put up 36. Hasn't done squat lately, and now he's back coming off the bench, but he is still a super high usage player, and I still think there's a chance he could get there. But what they did recently was they moved Justice Hill as well as Justice Hill was moved into the starting lineup, and Melendez was moved out, and then RJ Sunahara was moved out of the starting lineup as well. And they solidified it by going with Thomason, Demery, Hill, Abdur-Rahim, and then Chewa is that starting five. I tried to think the best way to word that, and there's no really good way to word it other than they were tinkering with it, and that's where they finally landed. And so that is the starting five for them. And recently, Demery and Hill have been the two guys seeing the most usage. I don't mind going with either of the two of them because they are very cheap. Russell Chewa is also very cheap, and in that game against Florida, he had a ceiling game as well, 36 fantasy points. So definitely some options on this Georgia side considering that they are all cheap. All right, that does it for this first segment. So let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then we're going to talk about the second 6 games. Now, heading on down to the next part of the slate, we have got Texas heading on the road to take on Houston. My Texas Longhorns taking on Houston. And this is another one of those games that you can just totally cross off, and I would not have a problem with it. I say that as a Texas fan. I just don't think this game environment is going to be all that great for DFS purposes. So KidPom has this one projected to be 72-61 in favor of Houston for a really low 133-point total. The last meeting between these two teams was back in Austin earlier this season. Houston won in overtime 76-72, and that one needed overtime to get to over 140, y'all. So I just don't feel like there's going to be a whole lot of points scored in this one. Now for Texas in that first game, only Asmus as well as Dylan Mitchell hit 4x value in that game. Asmus kind of took over the offense in the second half, and that was kind of the only way he got there. He really did a lot of it in the latter part of the game as opposed to the beginning. And then Dylan Mitchell got there because he was able to get a double-double. He put up 31 fantasy points. And, Houston's just such a tough defensive team. They're going to try to muck everything up that, I really think the only Texas guys I would want to go with would be, Dessou, Asmus, or Mitchell, just because I know those guys are going to touch the ball and they're going to be on the floor a ton. Kendall Weaver's an interesting one. I don't like his price tag at $5,000, but, he was used in that game against Houston to guard Jamal Shead, and I could totally see that being the case again here in this one. And if he's on the floor to guard Jamal Shead, he's going to be playing a ton of minutes because as we flip to the Houston side, Jamal Shead was their best player in that game, which makes sense. We've seen more physical, aggressive guards do really well against Texas, and Jamal Shead put up 42 fantasy points in that game on 24 total shots. So he's a guy that I probably would consider as a one-off play from this game. I say the same thing about Juwan Roberts. Offensive rebounding killed Texas in that game, and Roberts played 38 minutes and put up 32 fantasy points. It would not shock me to see him have a repeat performance of that. Emmanuel Sharp is also a guard that got in on the rebounding action in that game. He played 40 minutes in the original game and put up 28 fantasy points. For Houston, I would probably stick with my exposures to just Shead, Roberts, and Sharp. But again, this is not a game to stack. This is not a game you feel like you need to play a lot of guys from. Speaking of a game you don't want to play a lot of guys from, Arkansas taking on Mississippi State is next up. KenPom has this one projected to finish as Mississippi State 78-65. And look, Arkansas, they're just a dumpster fire. I'm just going to call it how I see it. They switch up their rotation, their starting lineup every game. You don't know what you're going to expect from them. This season has not gone as it was expected to go. It's been a colossal disappointment, and they don't really know how to end it. And so they're switching things up a lot. You don't really know what you're going to get from a game-in, game-out basis. Wait till you see the starting lineup before you play anybody. But in their last game, they started L. Ellis, Debo Davis. I was kind of combining the two names there, L. Ellis and Debo Davis. Tremont Mark at the 3, Chandler Lawson at the 4, and then Jalen Graham at the 5. That was their starting lineup. So those would be the guys that kind of played the most minutes. I'm not going to lie. I would be most likely to play Devo Davis or Jalen Graham. They both looked the best in that last game to me. Devo Davis played all 40 minutes against Tennessee and put up 22 fantasy points. That's pretty solid. And then Jalen Graham only played 23 minutes, but that's all he needed to put up 22 fantasy points. Those would be the main two guys I would consider. But, you've got Minifield and Battle who come off the bench and have a ton of usage. Mekhi Mitchell has been in and out of the coach's doghouse. You don't really know what to expect with this team, but there's a lot of guys that do have some upside if you're willing to take shots at them. Now, on the Mississippi State side, Toulouse Smith has been this team's usage leader when healthy, and I really like him a lot in this spot. We just saw Jonas Adu from Tennessee absolutely eat Arkansas alive, and Toulouse Smith can do the exact same thing if they allow him to. And I think he's probably my favorite play from this Mississippi State side, and I think he's a sneaky play because I think there's a lot of other guys in that range. They're going to get a lot more ownership than he does. Sean Jones has also done a really good job filling in for an injured DJ Jeffries. Last 3 games, 23, 20, and 16 fantasy points for Jones. Jones. That's not too shabby at all. And then you got Josh Hubbard, who is a guy who just jacks a ton of shots, and his fantasy outputs totally reflect how many of those shots he makes. And so in a game against Arkansas that is a pace up spot that's going to feature a decent number of possessions, not a bad look to get Josh Hubbard in a few lineups either. Next up, we have Duke heading to Tallahassee to take on Florida State. KenPom has this one projected to finish 78-73 in favor of Duke. And look, I got to be honest, the big fellas are how you want to target this Florida State team. So I'm definitely going to be playing Kyle Filipowski as well as Mark Mitchell. Filipowski broke a really long slump against Wake Forest, putting up 43 fantasy points in that game. And his price tag only jumped $300 on DraftKings. That's a very juicy price tag with a very juicy matchup. Love Filipowski in this spot, but don't sleep on Mark Mitchell either. He had 37 fantasy points in that game against Wake, and he's another guy that is just being aggressive, getting a ton of shots and attacking the rim, and I like both of them with this matchup. But also, Duke has really, really condensed the rotation, and they really condensed their usage. Filipowski, Mitchell, McCain, and Roach all played 30 minutes or more in that last game against Wake Forest, with Filipowski, McCain, and Mitchell all playing over 37 minutes. And all four of Filipowski, McCain, Mitchell, and Roach saw over 20% usage against Wake Forest. So those four guys, are going to be out on the floor and going to see a ton of usage. It has kind of left Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster as kind of the two odd men out. But I definitely think in this matchup against Florida State, pace up spot, Duke's going to score a ton of points. Get those big four into your lineups if you can. Now, on the Florida State side, look, Jameer Watkins has been their best player for the entire season. He's been their highest usage player. He's had the highest ceiling in fantasy, only needed 9 shots against Virginia Tech to put up 49 fantasy points. That's kind of insane, but I don't love the matchup here against Duke. But if you think this game is going to be kind of a shootout or is going to feature a lot of scoring, well, then Jameer Watkins would be the guy that you'd want to go with on the Florida State side. It's plain and simple. Now, Darren Green Jr. and Jalen Wari have kind of been the next two guys in line in terms of usage among the starting lineup, but they're not really consistent fantasy scorers. They're not really guys that are super duper dependable. I think that they would be more game stack pieces than anything else. I do like Primo Spears, though. Look, he comes off the bench and he just jacks shots. His playing time has been down lately, though, which does concern me a little bit. But when he's out there, he's going to be taking shots and he's going to have a chance to easily hit value if some of those shots start falling in. Next up, we have Virginia Tech taking on North Carolina in the Dean Dome. KenPom has this one projected to finish 81-70 in favor of North Carolina. And starting with Virginia Tech, look, everything starts and ends with Sean Padula. He has a massive usage rate, 31% usage on the season, and it was all the way up to 37% against Florida State. And that's kind of crazy considering he only took 9 shots in that game, but he got to the line, took 16 free throws. So that's how you get a usage rate that's that high. Anyway, you got to love a guy with that high of a usage rate in a pace-up spot against North Carolina. I think if you're looking to play this Virginia Tech side, go ahead and play Padula and find somebody to stack him with, whether it's Couture or Collins, one of the two shooters, Kidd or Barron, one of the two bigs. I don't like the matchups for Kidd and Barron, so I would probably, if I'm playing this Virginia Tech side, probably go with Padula and then probably MJ Collins just because he's pretty darn cheap at 4,800. On the North Carolina side, look, their defense doesn't force a whole lot of turnovers, which does give me a whole lot of optimism for Sean Padula, by the way. But also UNC kind of went really starting 5 heavy out of nowhere in their last game. Their starting 5 of Cadeau, Ryan, RJ Davis, Armando Bacot, and Harrison Ingram, they all played 30 minutes or more in their last game. And they're all 5 guys that can have big-time usage rates in a game and can have legitimate ceilings. We saw Cadeau with that big-time performance against Miami. Cormac Ryan against Syracuse, 24.5 fantasy points as well. So, everybody in this unit has a ceiling and everybody in this unit has a path to success. In terms of matchups, I love the matchup for RJ Davis. I love the matchup for Harrison Ingram. Virginia Tech is just not that athletic, in my opinion, and these are the two guys who should have very clear athleticism advantages at their spot. And then don't sleep on Armando Bacot, kind of like Kyle Filipowski. He's getting out of this little slump, and he's now back at a price tag of $8,400, which is still very reasonable for Armando Bacot, I might add. And he's had over 34 fantasy points in 4 straight, 2 of the 4 have been over 42 fantasy points. If you can't tell, it's getting a little late at night. I'm starting to lose focus, but I got to stay locked in. Got 2 more games to go, and I got to make sure that we finish this one and get the correct information out there. So we got Wisconsin and Iowa in the next game. Ken Pom has this one projected to be 80 to 78 in favor of Wisconsin. Look, Iowa's just a juicy matchup for any team they play, right? They play really fast. They don't play a whole lot of defense. Fantasy points galore, right? The last meeting these two teams played was earlier this season. Wisconsin won it 83 to 72, and in that game, the two big fellas for Wisconsin, Wall and Crowell, played lights out. Wall had 37 fantasy points, and Crowell had 35. And I'm inclined to go back to them in a matchup that 2 months later is still a very similar spot. And those two guys have been playing well recently as well. AJ Storr, also, we mentioned him all season long. He doesn't do a whole lot outside of score, but there's going to be more possessions in this game against Iowa. So if there's more possessions, then there's more opportunities for him to put up peripheral stats, right? So I don't mind him at only $6,600. And then don't sleep on Connor Essegian as well. I've mentioned him multiple times this season, as well as mentioned him in the Fantasy Corner Discord, trying to get people on the train. I thought he was one of the best offensive players last season, but for whatever reason, Greg Gard hates him and refuses to play him. But last game, or 2 games ago against Rutgers, he played 24 minutes and put up 18 fantasy points. We love that at a salary of $3,500. I think he is a GPP type, low-owned sleeper play at $3,500 with a great matchup. Now, on the Iowa side, Perkins and Freeman had the most success in that first game against Wisconsin. Perkins had 39 fantasy points. Freeman had 40. We know who Iowa is at this point. That Tony Perkins is going to be their usage leader. Sanford and McCaffrey and Dix are kind of the shooters on the wings. And then you got Cricky and Freeman, the post guys. And look, I've said for a while I don't like the price tags for the Iowa guys, and they're starting to come down. Like Sanford and Freeman now easily in the 7K range, with Cricky at 6,100. They're more reasonable to play, but I don't think they're great plays on this slate. I would probably stick this to being Perkins and Freeman because they had the most success against Wisconsin the last time. Last game of the day is Marquette taking on Yukon. Ken Pom has this one projected 77 to 70 in favor of the Huskies. For Marquette, we know about Tyler Kolek. Look, he's great, and he has a very legitimate, very high ceiling, and I would not complain at all if you wanted to play him. Is it the best matchup on the slate? No. Is it the best game environment on the slate? No. Is he one of the best point guards on the slate? Yes. Does he have one of the highest ceilings on the slate? Yes. So I have no problem playing Tyler Kolek. He probably won't make a whole lot of my lineups, but I definitely do think there's a little bit of interest there from my side. David Joplin is interesting because he is playing a ton of minutes recently. And if you're playing a ton of minutes, you're going to have opportunities to put up fantasy points. So I don't mind it at only $5,900. Cam Jones is the interesting one on this team, though. For about 2 years now, he's kind of been Tyler Kolek's wingman, and been a great shooter, great scorer for this Marquette team. But he's been kind of bad lately. Aside from the 39 fantasy points against Georgetown, which I think I could go up and put 39 fantasy points against. Maybe that was a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't think I'd put up 39 fantasy points against Georgetown, but anybody can put up buckets against Georgetown. And so other than that game, he's been objectively bad recently. He hasn't gotten above 19 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5. He's not playing the same minute totals that we're used to. It could be lingering effects from an ankle injury that he sustained way back in January. But if he finally does get right, he's at only $5,400 now. That's a super affordable price tag, and they're going to need him if they want to win this game against Yukon. Speaking of Yukon, all the discussion kind of starts and ends with Donovan Kinging, right? We know about Yukon's great starting 5: Newton, Spencer, Castle, Caravan, and Kinging. All 5 are solid options. I wouldn't have a problem with playing any of them, especially in a pace-up spot against Marquette. But Kinging is the guy that we got to have the most interest in. He's got the highest ceiling. He doesn't always play a ton of minutes, but if this game's going to be close and this is a big game in the Big East, then he's going to play more minutes and he's going to see more usage and he's going to have plenty of opportunities to put up fantasy points. Kind of like when he put up 47 fantasy points in 28 minutes against Butler. We also saw last year Adama Sanogo, the guy that started over Donovan Kinging on that championship team for Yukon. He had 2 big-time performances against Marquette last year, one in the Big East tournament and one in the regular season. So I do think that there is a possibility that Kinging can replicate that success and come through with a big-time performance here tomorrow. All right, so that does it for the second half of the slate, and I actually made pretty good time on that second half, if I'm being honest. Hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of information that you can use to help build some winning DFS lineups for this main slate on Saturday. If you like what you saw in the video, please hit the like button. It really does help me out a lot, and I really do appreciate it. Please rate and review the audio as well. I cannot stress it enough. It helps me so much when you guys do that. It helps people find the videos on YouTube, helps people find the podcast on Spotify, Apple, and wherever else. And I just really do appreciate when you guys do that. It means a lot to me, and you guys are the best. Now, also, If you do want more information from me, maybe you want to talk about the slate or talk about the later Saturday slates or any other slate for college basketball DFS for that matter. There's a few places where you can reach out. Follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I'm more than happy to answer any questions on Twitter, and I tweet out all updates that you need to know for the show. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. I am on record for saying I think that the Fantasy Corner Discord is the best Discord for college basketball DFS, and it's entirely free, and it's not limited to college basketball. We've got a lot of smart guys who play NBA, MLB, golf DFS, as well as college basketball. And it's a lot of fun to be a part of, talking ideas, bouncing plays off each other all day long, and then sweating it out together when the slate starts. And it's a blast. And if you're looking for people to talk DFS with, I cannot recommend it enough. And then also, if you want to know, I gave all this information out. If you want to know who actually makes my lineups, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. Every slate for college basketball DFS, I highlight my core plays as well as my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. And there's not a whole lot of people out there doing this for college basketball DFS. So if you want to know who actually makes the cut for me, how I am building and kind of what I'm thinking for each slate, then you can get that from the Patreon. All right, so that does it for this episode, y'all. So like I said, maybe not having an episode for the afternoon, the night slates. It'll depend on how the rest of the night goes. I'm not going to make any promises, but we'll see. But anyway, I hope to be back for the Sunday college basketball slate as well as the big Monday slate coming up on President's Day. So if you have not already, subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the audio feed. That way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season all the way through March Madness. All right, so that does it for the end of our session, guys. Best of luck to you on Saturday. Hope you guys got what you need from this video. Hope you guys can pick some winners. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.